You also saw the rise of HIV/AIDS outbreak in the United States, and it seems that in sort of my coming out process, it was apparent that there weren't a whole lot of gay men of your generation who were untouched by the spread of HIV/AIDS. How did that affect your life?
Well, I consider myself seriously to be a survivor, but I don't know too many people like myself. There was a generation pretty much wiped out. It did affect people, certainly, as I am in my 60s. So we're talking 30 years ago, people who were leading very lively and very promiscuous gay lives fell in large numbers. It affected me, frankly, minimally, for two reasons. Because my own behavior really didn't implicate myself with the virus directly, and I feel extremely lucky for that. And only 2 or 3 of my close friends fell. And that was horrible, and that was time out of joint. But I didn't know that many people who were directly affected. I certainly, the cultural and social and broader effects of it were just everywhere. And then certainly in the 80s, there was a hostile teaching environment. There was a general sense of panic in the early days. People didn't really begin to understand where the threat was coming from and to localize that threat for maybe 4 or 5 years in the middle of the 80s. I remember as late as 1988, very hostile and fraught class discussions about AIDS. So culturally and politically and in terms of my teachings, significant effects. Personally, I would have to say, relatively untouched.
Yeah. How, in your teaching now, you said that it sparked some heated discussions. What was that like? I mean, were you, at that point, were you out in the academic sense? Were you out to colleagues at that point in your life? Were you openly debating that in classes?
Oh, yes. I came out publicly and in my classes in 1975. So I've been out for a third of a century and more. And the epidemic didn't really become public and discussable until the early 80s. I had already begun teaching a gay politics class at that point. And all of my classes were infused with gay discussion. Certainly that class was. And as the virus came up, it was quite general among my big classes that involved lots of freshman students. For the 80s, for the decade of the 80s.
Right. Let's just touch for a minute on Harvey Milk. He's perhaps one of the best-known gay rights activists. What was it like teaching at that time when he was assassinated, and sort of what was going on around that? What did the ripple feel like through the gay community? And I would argue a ripple that's still being felt in the gay community today, the loss of a voice such as Harvey Milk.
It's hard to put the Milk story aside from what was going on at the time. And much of the rest of what was going on in the late 70s had to do with a general challenge coming from the religious right and the moral majority that was shaping up in a more general way. Milk was frankly a more minor figure at the time than he's become. Mm-hmm. And that's not to disparage the greatness of Harvey Milk in any way. But he didn't live in a cultural vacuum. And I suspect a lot of the gay movement back in that period was really involved in trying to push back against Jerry Falwell in that period and Pat Robertson in that period. Milk was central, but he was not the central story. He was the first openly office holder to be gay. But very quickly there were others.
Right.
And so his fall, I think, had local notoriety. I think it was very important in terms of making the gay movement more serious and more devotedly political. I don't think it had big social ramifications. It should have had more social ramifications in the general population, and it really didn't. It fell somewhere between Jonestown, which had happened the previous week, mm-hmm. and the general gay fight against religious oppression. It was frankly a local story in San Francisco. It didn't have the resonance that I think the 2 tellings on film have given it. I think the one that you know is the Hollywood version, and very good it is. I strongly recommend, by the way, the black and white recounting the times of Harvey Milk,
Right.
which gives more account of the trial and some of the consequences of the trial. In any case, Milk is significant, but he's not the central story.
Right.